The Artemis Accords. No, it's not a new sci-fi movie. It just may be the new Constitution for space. I'm Scott Ott, and this is Bill Whittle Now. And Bill, an article in a website called sciencealert.com drew my attention to the fact that NASA has drafted something dubbed the Artemis Accords that are basically some guidelines hoping to help private companies and nations cooperate and peacefully explore space. And the details of this right now aren't as important as the overall concept. One of the things it says in the article is that because private companies are becoming such a big part of the space programs and a lot of international space agencies starting to participate, it's getting kind of crowded and we need new rules to make everybody play nice. But it occurs to me, Bill, as I'm sure it has occurred to you years ago, that outer space has a jurisdiction. It needs laws, it needs enforcement mechanisms, and from whence should those arise is the big question here in general. Do you think we should throw this into the hands of the United Nations? After all, they've done such a fine job at regulating the international order here on Earth.
I don't think this is anything that the United Nations is going to get their hands on. And as far as enforcement of this law order goes, I may be going too fast in orbit around the moon at a certain altitude. Well, I guess the altitude would determine the speed, but let's leave that aside. Somebody's going to have to come up and write me a ticket, and that's really the basic nub of it. You know, is that you can make treaties and agreements and all the rest of it, but enforcing things that happen on the moon is tough. Obviously, the enforcement would have to happen to the companies back here on Earth. Look, there's only one thing that's really important about this accord, and that is whether or not you can own property in space. That's the only thing that matters. You couldn't before under I want to say it's the 1968 Space Treaty.
67.
But in any of 67. So there were a treaty was written where basically all the signatories agreed that space belonged to the human race, and we would be taking our United Nations shuttles out there to our United Nations properties and all the rest. Didn't pan out that way, and looking back on it, it's not much of a surprise. So the question becomes very simply, can you own property in space? And if so, what's the jurisdiction? How much can you own? How much can you claim? Can you claim a whole asteroid? If you land on it, stick a flag in it, the way that a Spaniard would come to Mexico and put his flag down and say, I claim this in the name of King Philip of Spain. Is there a limit on how much? But the main thing is ownership, because this time we're going to stay. And this time we're not going for prestige, and we're not going for even for exploration. This time it's going to have to pay. There's an asteroid out there that's not too tough to reach, that's got enough platinum in it, we figured out. It's where I think we mentioned this in passing. They estimate this one particular asteroid's worth $5 trillion, I think it was, just in platinum. That's relatively easy to get a hold of. $5 trillion is a pretty big prize. That's starting to get to be serious money now. And so all of the Artemis Accords is going to be based, I think, upon an agreement that is equitable in terms of property rights in space. But when I say equitable, I mean equitable among the people who are out there. The idea that I don't know, just take a country at random, Thailand owns asteroids that they can't get to, can't find, can't even see in terms of the naked eye, to me is ridiculous. But there will be that case made, no question. And those case has been made for 30, 40, 50 years now.
Well, Bill, it seems to me that at least the fundamental question that occurred to me when it comes to laws, when it comes to enforcement, when it comes to jurisdiction, is really who decides these things. It's not so much the details of what gets decided, but at some point, you know, here in the continental United States, a group of people sat down and drafted a constitution for the United States, and that thing designated jurisdictions for states, localities, the federal government. Mm-hmm. It also designated some enforcement elements of how the federal government would manage enforcement of its laws. And I'm trying to imagine, because Americans were first and still the best in space, if you want to look at it that way.
And I do.
Are the pioneers out there the ones who get to decide what the laws say and how they'll be enforced?
No, not quite. I think the people that send the pioneers are the ones that decide what the laws say and how they'll be enforced for a period of time, until such time as the pioneers become independent enough to make their own laws. The analogy of the Constitution is a really interesting one, because what the Constitution did was it provided a system of government for the colonies. It wasn't a system of government for the world, and at no time in the process did they ever imagine that the U.S. Constitution would apply to Great Britain. It applied to the people who were on the scene in the New World. And this is the kind of thing we're talking about. We don't have to come to an agreement on this around the world. We don't have to come to an agreement with Cuba on this, or China for that matter, or anybody else. What we have to do, I think the purpose, I can't tell you what the stated purpose is, but I have a very strong feeling that the intended purpose is that the people who are going to go agree to some rules, so we don't have to have, laser pistol shootouts when we get there. And that seems perfectly reasonable to me. But it also seems perfectly reasonable to me that the people who are ready to go, who are going to spend the money to go, and the risk and the lives and the effort and all of it, there's no obligation on those people to be coerced into sharing that with other people, nations, countries that are not taking the risk, they're not paying for it, they're not doing anything.
Well, let me drill down on this a little bit, Bill, because it occurs to me that if there's a jurisdiction, then the laws of the legislator of that jurisdiction determine the behavior and the punishable offenses within that jurisdiction. So right now, for example, the United Nations has a list, a register of objects launched into outer space. And about 87% of all the stuff that's floating around out there, satellites, probes, landers, and other space objects, have been registered, but it's voluntary. And so clearly 13% are not registered in this. And if you look at outer space and say, well, if you sign on to the voluntary, let's call it, for the sake of argument, the Artemis Accords, if you sign on to this, well, then you participate in this. If you're not a signatory, then you're a freelancer, you're a brigand, you're a pirate, what?
Well, in the same way that the law in the colonies, I think the American colonies, the history of the American colonies is not going to be replayed precisely, but I think it's the best historical analog that we have. When the first colonists arrived in America, let's just take the Mayflower. The Mayflower came with a set of morals and a set of agreed upon philosophy and agreed upon set of laws. They didn't come with a legal document, but certainly the Pilgrims all agreed pretty much on what norms of behavior would be, what punishments would be, what's legal and what's not, and so on.
Well, they did actually have the Mayflower Compact, to which they agreed. I believe they were offshore when they drafted that and signed on.
Well, then this would be the best example of what the Artemis Accords is right now. It would be an agreement from people who have not gotten there yet about what they're going to do, but it is not an agreement that required the permission of King George III, because King George III had nothing to do with this. This is the part that I think is the most important and salient issue about the Artemis Accords. We do not have an obligation. When I say we, I'm not just talking about the United States. I'm talking about SpaceX, any of them. They have no obligation, in my mind, to ask for the permission from or to be coerced into sharing any of the revenues for anything that they're doing as private companies. And likewise, I think that's true for nations as well. I think the issues that the Artemis Accord brings up are issues like, if SpaceX lands on the moon, and if Boeing lands on the moon, and NASA sends them both, if China lands on the moon, and India lands on the moon, how much of the moon is their territory? You have to have some understanding of this. You can't just imagine that legally we're going to say that an American astronaut could walk into a Soviet, that's just honest to God, That's just a lifetime of habits. I beg your pardon on that.
And the fact that you did a 13-part series on the Cold War, I think.
And a 4-part series on the space race. But let's take the European Space Agency, probably the least likely to get there out of the main contenders for the foreseeable future. But let's say there's a European Space Agency moon base. I don't imagine anybody would agree that an American astronaut has a right to drive over there, walk in, help himself to the refrigerator. So you would at least imagine that the property that is the actual station would belong to the people that put it there. And then you'd have to start asking questions about how much of a yard do they have, and how far does it go, and how big is the land claim, and so on. These are actual genuine issues, and they have been resolved in the past. It's not the first time that humans have had to deal with parceling up property that they haven't been to yet, or at the very most generous definition, has not been developed yet. The Ohio, there was an Ohio project to settle Ohio. A lot of people from Maine and some people in New England basically bought shares in Ohio, and they would put their money into this back in Massachusetts, and this money would entitle them to certain agreed upon land grants. They all just loaded up the truck and they drove to,
Marietta.
Cleveland. Yeah. And when they got there, they had a structure for the fundamental rules of the colonization process. And as their time there established, and as the population grew, they develop more sophisticated laws, and that's certainly what we'll see in space as well. But really, I think the only thing that the Artemis Agreement does that is really important, honestly, is that it supersedes the International Space Treaty and basically says, well, we're going to get stuff that's valuable, and we're going to put stuff down, and we're not going to take it off again, and it's not going to be a historical site. It's going to be property, and who owns it, and what's the radius of ownership, things like that.
Well, and this is just an afterthought, so I'll keep it brief on this one. But the Accords also ask international partners to protect current sites and artifacts with historical value. In other words, there are sort of there's a register of historic places on the moon, one of which was, where the original moon landing happened, for example. And apparently there's some 400,000 pounds of stuff that we've taken to the moon, not just us, but anybody who's gone to the moon, mostly us. And it's up there now, and so there's just an idea that had never occurred to me that there's already historic locations on the moon, and there's a national Apollo 11 park. This is
a really important point. All the Apollo landing sites should be preserved forever, untouched. I mean, really untouched. They should be preserved forever. This goes for things for like the Soviet landers and so on. They're maybe the area around them not quite so large. I think probably the most interesting example. No, not because they were Soviet. It's because they were unmanned.
Oh.
But probably the most interesting example in the real world, and I mentioned this in the Apollo 11 series last year. There's pretty compelling evidence that the upper stage of Apollo 10, which was a unique mission for a number of reasons, I can get into that, but that the upper stage of Apollo 10, which was nicknamed Snoopy, went into orbit around the sun, and it appears that it's been recovered. So there's a pretty good chance that out there right now, closest approach will be about 4 million miles to the Earth. It's about 16 times the distance to the moon. In any event, there is a piece of metal out there that's not much larger than, in fact, is no larger than 2 airplane bathrooms cemented together. And it's the upper stage from the lunar module on Apollo 10. That vehicle needs to be untouched. I could see a scientific expedition dealing with it and dealing with it in the way that you would deal with any other archaeological site. But things like this are sacrosanct, they're sacred, and they need to be kept that way. We saw the U.S. go through a period there in the 90s where Civil War battlefields were just completely being encroached upon, and enough of an uproar happened to walk that back. So yeah, those kind of things remain untouched. And just one final button for me, super, super fast. I'm not trying to say that, I mentioned Thailand, for example. Look, if Thailand wants to invest $1 billion into SpaceX, and own a share of whatever they're doing, then that's perfectly fine with me. I'm not talking about a technological issue. I'm talking about an ownership issue. I'm talking about skin in the game.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're grateful to the members of BillWhittle.com who have made it possible for us to explore these ideas and to look to the future. If you've not yet become a member, you can go to BillWhittle.com and click the big green Become a Member button. We'd also like to thank our friends over at the Patriot Post for their contribution to this enterprise. And they would like to say thank you to you by providing you not only with free email updates that will give you the latest in news and opinion and even humor from Patriot Post, but also they're going to give you a free copy of the Patriots, what do they call it? Primer. The Patriots Primer on American Liberty. So check that out in the description below. For Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks for watching.